probably get started here. All right. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking the time and coming to our session here on data and information governance in the public interest. My name is Steve Coots, and I am a research analyst at Open North's Applied Research Lab. And for some of you may be familiar with Open North, but for those who aren't, we're a nonprofit based in Montreal, and we work on issues of data and technology with a focus on the public interest, obviously, and making sure data and technology are used for good and effective and consistent purposes, especially in public institutions. So with that, I'll let my co-presenter introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. I'm Anne Heppel-White. I'm currently the manager of records, property, and evidence at Hamilton Police Service. I've spent most of my career in municipal information and records management with a background in archives. And before this presentation kind of came up, Steve and I had not met, and we've spent some time over the last few months kind of weaving this presentation together and learning from each other. So we're really hoping that some of our conversation is helpful for everyone else.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that that in a microcosm of Anne and I being put together by Erie Conga for this presentation is a bit of what it'll be a bit of a theme in this presentation of bringing together different perspectives. And so what we want to do today is, changing slides, what we're going to do is give you a high level view of data and information governance from each of our perspectives. So myself coming from a nonprofit research angle, and Anne from her public sector records management perspective. And so a few of the kind of questions we're going to touch on today are what are the big challenges and opportunities when it comes to data and information in the public sector? What is data governance? What is information governance? How are they different and how are they related? And most importantly, what can data and information professionals working across organizations learn from one another? And so just to unpack a bit of the title of our presentation, we really wanted to anchor this webinar in some set of principles. And we talk a lot about the public interest, but what do we mean by the public interest? It's a very broad concept, and it can be used to support a whole range of goals and objectives. But let's talk about it by way of mentioning some of the opportunities and challenges that public sector institutions are encountering when it comes to data. So I think a lot of us are familiar with this narrative these days, right? That there are these huge opportunities to be realized from managing data assets within an organization in a more effective way. And we also know that more data is being collected and used than ever before. There are new data streams, new technologies. We have more data than we know what to do with sometimes. And some of the opportunities that are articulated in a public sector setting are, of course, streamlining and making efficient operations and service delivery, improving planning, adding more of a data-driven decision-making lens, sharing knowledge and infrastructure across organizations or between different levels of government, different jurisdictions. And of course, the public-facing component, creating more opportunities for citizens and residents to see inside the black box, to have a window into the workings of government, and have some kind of say in what happens in their community, whatever that might be. But we also know that there are challenges, right? And this is by far not an exhaustive list, but I mean a few of the challenges that we know about when it comes to any kind of organization using its data, and public institutions are no different. Is that there is, for one thing, while there's been a lot of progress in terms of opening up data and making connections and realizing the value of data outside of the specific context in which it was collected, there are still a lot of silos that we know of, and we know that in some organizational contexts there isn't necessarily a full awareness of what data even exists, and let alone how it can be used in a an effective way, or what might be new or interesting or impactful kind of uses of that data. And of course, we're also aware of the risks, right, that we hear about in terms of the cybersecurity, the data breaches, privacy concerns are on everyone's radar these days. And we know that, in terms of just to address the recent, the pandemic and the sort of concerns around data that's exposed, it shows at least that, when you think about contact tracing, for instance, or different data being made available in timely fashion, that can aid the response to that. That there is a segment of the population, or a growing segment of the population, that's attuned to these issues around data and around sensitive data, and that public trust is sort of intimately bound up in these questions of how data is used within public institutions. And another issue here is, of course, we know that organizations don't exist in isolation, that they are interacting with other actors, that they are procuring services from vendors through public-private partnerships, other third-party arrangements. That introduces another level of uncertainty and risk when it comes to data. And we can see some of these, challenges, especially as we look towards emerging technologies, and we think about things like artificial intelligence and machine learning driven decision-making systems. We know that the data inputs to those and making sure that they are that they are accurate and that they are of good quality are going to be more important than ever. And I think a lot of these issues, I mean, certainly not the beginning of it, but the Sidewalk Labs case in Toronto highlighted a lot of issues. It was kind of a bit of a moment of realization for a lot of people that these data issues, reach into our lives in increasingly pervasive ways. And it was certainly a moment where that I made a lot of connections between these emerging data issues and the kind of the very real ways in which these things touch our lives. And I mean, I think just to highlight the broader discourse around data that example brought up was the notion of brought up issues of control of data, democratic control, and the role of public institutions in holding data and being accountable to a public versus institutions that or firms that aren't accountable to the public, and how their relationship to data differs. The question of whether we need new models or new digital rights to support or to augment the existing relationships we have to data. So there's this kind of swirling discourse around data that's informing all these conversations that we don't have time to get into today in depth. But what we do want to talk about is how, at the end of the day, public sector organizations, of course, you have to deal with what's in front of you. and you can only deal with the data that you have control over. But when it comes to that data, there are a couple objectives that we talked about just a minute ago. So on the one hand, there's this imperative to get the most value out of data. And that can be the data that is held directly by a public institution or by in partnership with with vendors or third parties. Making sure it's able to be used in an efficient or consistent way to make better decisions, improve services, to create more opportunities for engagement with citizens. But on the other hand, there is equally this imperative to minimize risks and ensure that data is used in a responsible and accountable way. And so one aspect that we want to talk about today is of course data governance and what role it can play in achieving both of those goals. And going beyond the idea that it's just about principles, which are of course a key a foundation for data governance, but more importantly is that it sets up a clear framework around who makes decisions about data within an organization, how they make them, and how they're held accountable. And when we think about data governance and data management and what the difference is, data management is really just the implementation of the data governance. It's really putting it into action, whereas data governance is that overarching strategy or plan, or if you want to think of it as a consistent narrative or story about data that your organization is telling. But we want to emphasize that it's not just about data governance. Data is one piece. But if we just think about data in isolation from the other information that a public institution holds, we are missing out on a large part of the picture. And like I say, the key theme of this presentation is that there is already a wealth of expertise within our public institutions in the form of different professionals working in data and information adjacent disciplines. And I think that the key is unlocking that knowledge, being able to bring it together and learn from each other in order to address in a more holistic way the kind of data and information challenges and needs that we are encountering today. And so with that, I will pass it over to Anne.
Thanks, Steve. So I'd like to think that data governance exists not in a vacuum, but in an ecosystem of allied professions that can collectively bring together tools and techniques that will serve the ultimate goal of organization-wide strategic information management. Seems like a lofty goal, but it can really begin when we start talking with each other. So I come from the perspective of my education is in archival studies, and I've spent most of my career as a public sector records manager. And so I'd like to share some concepts that I believe are helpful in navigating this information governance journey. So we'll just start with the next slide. So what is information? What is the next slide, Steve? Sorry. Records management. There we go. That's the organizational function devoted to the management of information in an organization throughout its life cycle, from the time of creation or inscription to its eventual disposition. But at the core of records management is the record itself. And we know that the record differs from data in that it is a document made or received in the regular course of business and kept for administrative, operational, or historical purposes. But let me stop right there, because it's also pretty amazing to me that there are so many different definitions of records. And most of them do that thing that English teachers in high school always told us not to do when we're describing things. They give a long list of the kinds of documents that might be a record, rather than focusing on the essence of what makes a document a record. So I find these inconsistent definitions are smattered across Canadian legislation, and they create challenges for legislators and the courts alike. Because what if you find a document that's not listed in that long list of things that might be a record. I think it's much more useful to focus on the definition that I've provided here because it attempts to cover the conditions that must be present for a document to be considered a record. It starts with it being a document, that it must be received or made in the regular course of business and kept to fulfill administrative, operational, or historical purposes. And that last bit's really important, as we often create documents that are so fleeting in their usefulness that they're not kept for any length of time and can be discarded without being committed to the system of rules that make up a corporate records management program. These are often described as transitory records, and in most records management policies, documents that meet their definition may be destroyed without being accounted for. All of the things that I'm describing here are rules that have been developed as part of an information governance program. They're set up so that we know how and why we deal with the records in our organizations. And I think there are a lot of lessons that can be learned as we develop data management and data governance programs as well. But because it's where I belong and where I come from, I'm going to focus a little bit longer on the record. So while a record can be a document that stands alone, it's most often part of a collection of documents, a file or a dossier. And those files or those dossiers, what they do is they document a process. They don't just spring into existence out of somebody's head. They're developed as the residual product of doing business. So think of the process that's involved in developing a request for proposals. The RFP itself is the product of a process that involves consultation, drafts, rewrites, review, correspondence, approvals, etc. And the file that includes these documents tell the story of the RFP's development. Then you have to go through the whole process of posting it, having bids come in, answering questions, eventually to the point where you would be awarding a contract. So all of those documents tell the story of how you arrived from deciding that you needed to go to market for a product and actually achieving the purchase of the product itself. So just to give a little bit of background, I learned about records management when I was at school learning to be an archivist. And just to step things back a little bit, I'd like to say that I feel that the circumstances of my education and the route that I took to get there give me a little bit of a different perspective on the records life cycle. Archivists are entrusted with researching and describing the circumstances of a record's creation, its administrative history, and the context in which it came into being, in order to give researchers the clues that they need to answer the questions that they bring to the records. Archival arrangement and description is a service provided to the researcher that functions to both contextualize and authenticate the records. This happens long after the record has served its primary use in supporting an action. The archivist gets the record as a memory of actions past. The records manager is the bridge between the business use of the record and its future life as a reference of actions past, or recycling material, because we don't keep everything. Ideally, the records manager works with the record creator within the business context to help leverage its maximum value to the organization, to make solid disposition decisions early in the life cycle, creating efficiencies that allow energy to be spent on preserving only those records that need to be preserved. In archival science, there is a concept called the archival bond, which I think is really useful for anyone interested in information governance. It refers to the relationship between the records that immediately precede and succeed each other within an activity. When records are physically arranged, it's tangible and easy to physically see. In an electronic environment, the archival bond may be discovered within the filing identifiers, within the metadata that constitute the data dictionary, within an automated business process, or within an electronic file. It's a principal determinant of the meaning of the document, as it is the intellectual connection between the document and the activity that gave rise to its existence. The records are more than their individual form and function. They also derive meaning from their function within a procedure or process. And these concepts were created by archivists working with physical records, but they are vitally relevant to the management and preservation of electronic records as well. Over to you, Steve.
And unmute myself. Thanks, Anne. I think it's interesting that what Anne just described is, by taking us through this records management approach, is that it's more than just a collection of individual data or information management policies or processes. I mean, it's certainly that, but it's also moreover, it's a framework that that really centers that story or that original intention behind why organizations keep records in the first place. And so having that overview or that framework, it gives meaning to all the tasks that you'll do in handling and disposing of records. So I appreciate that there's a kind of deliberateness and purpose there, and it's something I think to learn from when we think about other kinds of information or data. So in this next part, we want to shift gears a bit and just talk about you know, what does data, or if you want to say information governance as well, what does it consist of? I referred before to the idea that you know, there's a lot of discussion of you know, whether we need new models or new approaches towards data governance. That you know, do we need to overhaul our institutions or the way that we, you know, our current data practices? I think it's important to note, of course, like there are no off-the-shelf data governance models that you can just plug and play and you know, drop into any organizational context. The context is going to be different, and in every organization, the reasons why you collect data, the value you get from it is going to be different, and you need to work within that and develop and assemble the building blocks, as we like to call them, that that enable you to, you know, to tell that story about data in the most effective way. And so that context, of course, includes the objectives you want to achieve, the public interest objectives, however you articulate that, and recognizing there can be and probably are multiple articulations or levels of how the public interest is kind of defined. There's of course the context of the legislative and regulatory you know, restrictions and guidelines that you're working within that can't be ignored. And of course, public institutions are bound by a particular set of rules around how data can be used, especially, you know, especially personally identifiable information. And as I alluded to before, there's this broader cultural kind of context around what is seen to be acceptable or what is expected to be done with data, and you know, and how people expect it to be handled. And so once you have those initial pieces, that initial context, you can start by thinking about, okay, what do we need specifically? What kind of data? What is the actual, you know, what is the substance of the data that we're dealing with, or that we plan to deal with in the future? Because it should always be a goal to build something that is build a framework that is durable and adaptable over time. Otherwise, it loses its relevance, right, as new situations come up. You know, what is the life cycle of your data, and recognizing there are many different kinds of data, and like there could be many different life cycles that you have to think about and bring together. And also thinking about the kind of the external or internal relationships. If it's about, you know, sharing data internally among departments, there's a different set of considerations than if you're talking about open data, for instance. If you need to have a separate set of processes that allow you to make data open and available. So I mean, the answers to all these and more questions help you get to, you know, what kind of mechanisms do you need in order to build up this data governance framework. And there are a few different kinds, and this is one way of thinking about the different types of pieces that you need. And it's these three kinds of mechanisms. So we have structural, procedural, and relational mechanisms. And this comes from an academic approach developed by Abraham, Schneider, and von Bruck that we've used a bit at Open North's Applied Research Lab in looking at data governance. And it helps to, when you're looking at a broad swath of data practices that are specific to different organizational contexts, it helps to be able to look at them and understand what is their functional kind of role within a data governance program. And so we have structural mechanisms, which are, of course, you know, as the name suggests, they're these kind of static things, right? They could be decision-making bodies, accountability frameworks, reporting relationships. It could be the degree of centralization or decentralization. So we know a lot of organizations are moving towards a more unified approach, where there's, say, a chief data officer or somebody who has a broad mandate within an organization to to oversee data and to kind of realize its value across like a multitude of organizational units. There are also, of course, a plethora of procedural mechanisms, and so these would be the practices and the policies and standards that we employ in really enacting the data governance. So I think this connects up a lot to some of the data management practices. If you think about, for instance, a privacy impact assessment and the role that it plays in allowing you to make an assessment about the potential impacts of a data collecting activity, or the ability to make that data open. It really provides you a documented process to follow and a consistent process at that to measure a data set against an agreed upon set of criteria to determine whether it can be made open or not, which then feeds into other processes and procedures depending on which direction you decide to go. And the third kind of mechanism is this relational mechanism. So it's really about it's concerned with how do you coordinate within a data governance program? How do you facilitate communication across different parts of the organization, especially if you're a large organization? How do you ensure the sustainability and the durability of that program by building up staff capacity, by forming communities of practice, by sharing and communicating and carrying that knowledge forward, and creating new champions for data and information governance in your organization. And it also includes, if you have a public-facing component, if you have processes where you're interacting with the public, or you're communicating the value of your data governance, or how your organization is using data, it's a key component of that, of making people aware of the work that's being done. And all these mechanisms, if you look at a given data practice, it can involve elements of all of these, right? And they all are interconnected. That structures sort of maybe determine what processes and procedures are followed, and you need these relationships in order to sustain and communicate these throughout the organization. And so building blocks is, again, just a way of understanding or being able to name these things when you encounter them, but they really need to be understood as all, like building blocks in a foundation, to use a building metaphor. I mean, that they really only have meaning in relation to each other and to the overall framework that they help create. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Anne.
Thank you. So all of the components that Steve was talking about in terms of building a data governance program are also applicable in building an information management program or a records management program. So I think that there's a lot that we can learn from each other when we break down some of the barriers that exist within our organizations to communication. I'm just going to go through a few concepts from archival studies that I think as well bring some value and richness to the discussion about uh, forging ahead with governance programs and making sure that the plan that you have really serves the public interest and is grounded in principles of uh, serving the public trust. So understanding the records, and I will be talking always about records. It's because uh, that's my background and that's my default. With the understanding that we're coming from different perspectives, and I think that this information can help inform data governance. I'm not trying to exclude the word data from my conversation. I'm just kind of owning my own background here. So, understanding the record's external environment is also crucial to understanding its meaning to the organization. And context is what pulls everything together and gives it situational importance. Archival science uses the concept of administrative history to describe the context of a group of records and how it came to be from a historical perspective. And this exercise helps to provide the researcher with an understanding of the records within the context of their creation. What outside forces may have influenced their character. And all of this information is used by the researcher to further understand the history being studied. An administrative history will describe the organization that created the records, any predecessor organizations, and also explain its genesis and development. So in creating these administrative histories, archivists will use annual reports, they will use organization charts to try and understand how organizations created and used their records. Taking the time to step back and understand why the data was collected, to ask questions about why it was collected this way and what processes or questions gave rise to the collection activity, all inform our understanding of the data itself. These concepts are very much interchangeable and cross-functional. And also central to the work of the records manager is this concept of authenticity. We have to ensure that the records can be relied upon to support the action that they are documenting. We're very concerned with ensuring that the records we care for can be used as evidence of action taken or not taken. And this is where I think there's a little bit of a divide here. The records manager doesn't decide what records are created. The records are the organic residue of the actions of the organization. And this is true sometimes in the case of data as well. The data is produced from transactional databases, and then we're able to mine that information. But we do make choices about what we choose to study and analyze. One of the tools that is used by archivists in determining the authenticity of records is the study of diplomatics. It's a discipline that was developed by medieval monks to detect forgeries, and it's still useful today. It's a very complex discipline and has great potential in the realm of born digital records. It is the study of the creation, form, and transmission of records and their relationship to the facts represented in them and to their creator in order to identify, evaluate, and communicate their nature and authenticity. I think it's pretty well agreed upon in the archival world that Professor Luciana Durante is the expert on diplomatics in in the world. She's also the chair of the Inter Pares project, which focuses on the authenticity and trustworthiness of digital records. And if you're really curious, Google her. She's quite an amazing woman. So Diplomatics uses the elements of the record, its form and function, as well as the procedure that led to the creation of the record to authenticate it. If you think of the metadata that's used in the transmission of an email, to give a really kind of simple example, can begin to uncover all of the steps that are undertaken to take the message from its sender to its recipient. It's wrapped up in all the code that creates readable text, gets routed from server to server, and reaches its destination, where it may be further manipulated and rerouted. All of this information is useful in the field of digital forensics, and for the records manager, figuring out context and authenticity. Another really important concept is trustworthiness. Next slide. And the trustworthiness of records continues to be, and I think even more so, will continue to be a concern. With the prevalence of cloud services, the issue of ownership of information can become blurred. And we know that records can be altered, their context distorted, and made to misrepresent the original intention. So here, the whole concept of knowing your sources, checking your sources, and being sure of what it is that you're looking at is so incredibly important. Authenticity and trustworthiness really kind of fit together in the world of records management. So as self-service and convenient access to information becomes more and more prevalent, the trustworthiness of our original sources is paramount and so much more important. And I'm hoping that more and more organizations start to look at laying bare some transparency and being able to ensure that what they are putting forward is able to be examined by the user so that they can be sure that they can trust the information. Protecting our records and data from manipulation and distortion of context, I think, is one of the most challenging but important endeavors that we have across our allied professions. And that leads into, from protection, leads into preservation, which is the next slide. So we've talked a little bit about life cycles. Steve talked about it in his discussion of data governance building blocks. And the records life cycle can be considered a fairly linear process. A record travels through time, it's created, and then it's used for a period of time, and then we may keep it for reference or legal reasons. And then at the end of the day, usually, we shred or recycle that record. But if the decision is that we need to keep that record for the long term, for posterity, then we really need to think about the resources that we put in place, because the organization has now taken on the commitment to preserve those records over time and has to put some effort into ensuring that they are accessible over time. We know that preservation decisions, if made very early in the life cycle, can be very effective. In the paper world, a good example is if, say, your organization produces minutes of its decision-making body, those minutes are likely to be permanent, and we can ensure that they are created, printed on high cotton content, acid-free paper, stored in a room with appropriate environmental controls in order that they be accessible for many years to come. For digital records, we may need to assess proprietary formats, encapsulate the records, or use a digital preservation partner to ensure long-term access and usefulness. All of these things, I think, can come to a head in consultation with your records management folks who are working on retention schedules. If you bring forward your data sets and say, we need to really think long-term about how it is we're going to preserve this data because we know that it's going to be useful, or we don't know that it's going to be useful, we think it might be in the future. We don't want to lose it. These are some of the things that we really have to be thinking about. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks a lot, Anne. Yeah, I think that lens on the records management and archival, that perspective, it really highlights how we often talk about, we often think about data, and we think about it in terms of that we're collecting it and using it with greater speed than ever, and we have to make use of it right now, and it's all about leveraging data and information for today's needs. But I think having that longer term perspective, and like thinking about how these systems and frameworks, like how they carry us into the future, and how there's this expectation, especially for public institutions, that they're going to last, and that they're going to there's going to be this continuity, and so I think there's a lot that we can learn there about how to make these how we can deal with information and data in a really sustainable, like over the long term kind of way. So we're going to start to wrap things up, and I mean, I know this has been a bit of a whirlwind tour through a lot of different concepts, and as we mentioned, we were tasked with kind of bringing together our different perspectives and seeing what kind of came out of that, out of making those connections. And I think, as mentioned at the beginning, there is already a lot of expertise within public institutions, and we think of governments, and we think of that there are IT folks, of course, where data has traditionally been the kind of their kind of core mandate, at least from like a corporate IT perspective, to the records management folks. And even within cities, you have librarians, of course, and I know Anne comes from a bit of that background as well. So there are all sorts of professionals across public institutions that are dealing with data, and of course across all different departments and functions of government, data is being created and used on a daily basis. So recognizing that to some degree there everyone or a lot of different people within an organization are experts to some degree in data and information. Moving from a kind of piecemeal or siloed approach towards something that's more holistic and accounts for all of the variety and of the ways in which we use data information, and that requires a bit of a deliberate approach to bring those pieces together. And we know that there are a lot of institutions that are on the forefront of this, and they're already moving, they've already moved towards this approach, towards this, taking this unified perspective towards data, and appointing, chief data officers and data stewards, and really having that lens of not just how do we use data in our operations, and how do we mitigate risks, but also having that broader view of how do we get the most value out of what we've got, right? So, but we also recognize that a lot of organizations are not, are at different points in their thinking, and maybe they're just starting to think about this in a more holistic way, or wondering how these conversations can get started. And how to move towards a different way of governing data and information. So with that, we want to leave you with a couple of just thoughts, a couple of closing considerations that sort of sum up what we've been talking about. The first, like I've been saying, is that the data information that your organization collects, or the way in which you use it, and collect it and dispose of it and preserve it, and all of those activities that you do with it, that all needs to tell, there needs to be a consistent story or narrative there about what value your organization places on data. And that needs to be aligned, of course, with how you present your your mission or your goals, or like how you articulate the public interest, especially. So there needs to be that alignment there, and it needs to be clear, right, what that connection is. Like, how does the data support, your organization's mission? At the end of the day, that's what it's about. It's not its own, data and information isn't its own end. It's obviously meant to support actual, operations and services and planning and all of those things that public institutions do. And so this also means bringing together a lot of those disparate kind of strategies that might already exist. So there might be, kind of corporate IT plans. There might be procurement plans of how, procure technology from outside vendors that might be collecting data. Open data strategies, of course, are, a lot of governments have those. Digital infrastructure plans, plans within departments about how they manage their data. There needs to be a framework at least, to bring all those things together into conversation with one another. And so by formalizing and kind of concretizing this clear and consistent message about data and information in a framework, in a holistic framework, you're starting to build trust with your stakeholders, whoever those might be. Usually we're talking about citizens or residents in the context of public institutions. So knowing that there's a plan for data is a key contributor to building trust, and then actually following through on that framework by implementing those things through sound data and information and records management processes. Public institutions also have the added responsibility of being open and transparent, especially these days when there is, trust in institutions is in flux, we could say, and it kind of wanes. I don't know, you can argue one way or the other right now, but we know that there is concern. People are more attuned to these issues. They pay attention to what their public institutions are doing, and so that openness and transparency being built into how you manage data and information in your organization is incredibly important in building that trust. And another part of this is being able to be responsive. Having a framework that isn't rigid, that's adaptive and flexible and reflexive, right? Willing to reassess and reevaluate practices and make sure that they remain relevant over time, and as data and information change, and as values and as expectations around data change, right, in the broader culture. So there needs to be that responsiveness. And finally, we know change can be slow to come from within institutions, public ones especially, and there may be good reasons for that. And we know that overhauling existing practices isn't something that's going to happen overnight. So if there isn't currently direction from higher level officials within an institution, if there isn't that mandate coming down that we need to develop a holistic data and information strategy, I think one thing that can be done kind of from the bottom up in a kind of a grassroots way with civil servants is to start just initiating conversations among colleagues and within these different allied professions that we know exist within institutions. And in doing so, you start to build up that an informal community of practice around data information. You start to make the connections and to identify those opportunities where you can build something that's more holistic and that accounts for all the differences and in how you want to use data and information. So that's about all we've got for you with all of those considerations that we've left you with. And I know that there are some questions that we will get to in a moment, but just want to thank you for listening to our little presentation there. And what we want to do is, I know we have some questions in the Q&A already, so we can get to those. And we also have a few prompts in case you haven't thought of a question and have something you want to ask us. With that, we can move down the list of questions. I see we have 3 here. The first question we have is for Anne.
All right.
And I don't know if you can see it here. Anne, can you talk a bit more about the open data products at Hamilton Police Services? Is Hamilton Police Services ahead or behind of other police services in publishing open data? Are there upcoming publishing plans for open data?
It's a great question. Thank you very much. So just to let you know, I've only worked for Hamilton Police since September. And my main focus is bringing in a coordinated records management program. But subsequent to my hire, there was also a fantastic hire in a manager of analytics. And she heads up our corporate information and analytics unit. This had been in existence for a while before, but it had been supervised by a police officer. So they were really focusing on what was mostly operationally useful for them. As you can imagine, in police services in 2021, public trust is of paramount importance, and as is transparency. And so we're focusing a lot on doing some of those building block exercises that Steve talked about between my area, which includes access and privacy and provision of creation of police records, and the analytics unit. So we're really looking at what kind of decision trees do we have in place to ensure that the data that we do make available is appropriately available. And to get down to the core of your question, would I say that we're ahead or behind other police services? I would say that we're catching up. So I hope that I answered that question.
Thanks, Anne.
Yeah.
Have another question here, which maybe I can attempt to answer. So where do we place legal aspects of data governance into building blocks? Is it procedural or relational? An example of a legal aspect of data governance can be a data sharing agreement. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think there are maybe a couple of things when we think about legal aspects. Of course, there's the legislative and regulatory context, right, that you're operating within, and we can think about different, MFIPA, for instance, in the context of municipalities that specify how PII should be handled, and so those different pieces of legislation are going to set the tone, right, for what kinds of data governance you might need, right? They're going to inform that, and some might be more prescriptive than others in terms of, having to establish compliance mechanisms, for instance, to really specifically comply with a provision of legislation. So I mean, there's that aspect. In terms of things like data sharing agreements, I think, if we're talking about kind of those can be, I think, considered a bit of a procedural mechanism in the sense that they're documenting the conditions under which data can be accessed, the conditions for use. They are, they're a voluntary agreement that's being entered into, so they're not necessarily like the background legislative kind of requirements, but they're going to impact on how an organization sets up its data governance, and what kinds of structures are needed to to enforce those agreements or to enact the provisions of a data sharing agreement. So I think it can be considered a procedure in a way.
So the next question from Jonathan here. How can public archives keep pace with AI that is speeding ahead without much concern for traceability? So I'm not sure, so that you're saying that the AI is speeding ahead without the concern for traceability. So just to be fully open, I'm not currently working as an archivist. I very much am still interested in the field, and I keep kind of an eye on what's going on social media and through the associations. But I can tell you that archives are critically concerned with electronic records and with new means of communication and how we document our lives. So I've really seen in the last 10 years an explosion in new kinds of jobs for digital archivists, for example. Some of the work that I was talking about before by Professor Durante and the Inter Pares project is concerned with how we analyze and how we use electronic records internationally, and what mechanisms are in place for us to analyze those records. What's really pretty cool about electronic records is there is always a trace. There really is. There's always a some kind of roadmap that you can unravel to figure out how things came to be. Sometimes that's not easy or straightforward, but it does exist. So I think that the way that public archives are trying to keep pace is to skill up and to hire for the kinds of skill sets they need to really follow and document those new technologies that are reflective of our current life. So I'm just, the next question, Steve, what do you think? Public policies that regulate companies or government institutions to adapt standards for shared documents such as open data. There are, yeah. There sure are. So go take a look at the Canadian General Standards branch from the federal government. You can take a look there at what is the name of the policy? It's the standard on electronic documents as documentary evidence, and it is really, really helpful for those of us who are embarking on any kind of digitization policy or procedure. It's actually been tested in Canadian law out in Alberta, so that's one that I can think of. But yeah, there are a number of policies that regulate, or I should say, suggest standards for how it is we should be using and collecting and describing our information.
And I guess there's a key. Adequate. I guess there's a key distinction there to be made between, standards being voluntary, obviously, in most cases, and yeah, at what point is there a mandate to adopt a standard? It seems like, I think there at some point there is a critical mass, right, where it becomes it becomes, in the beginning you might have a variety of local standards being used around, say, like open data, right? Eventually there's some kind of convergence around the standard, right, which makes it the standard. Of course, you can have competing ones, and you have standards creating bodies, and I know right now there's the Canadian standards. Sorry, I'm trying to think of the name. The Standards Association, standards body in Canada, convening the data governance standardization kind of framework. So they're creating a roadmap, at least, for a way to bring together these kind of different standards from across industry and across different sectors into some kind of unified framework. So, so I mean, hopefully we're seeing some kind of convergence around that, and yeah. Let's see.
All right.
No more questions in the Q&A, but we're certainly keen to hear if what resonated from our presentation, or if there are any things that made you go, I don't know if I agree with that, or and especially if you're if you're working within a public institution or any kind of organization, really be curious to know how other folks are reconciling these different elements of data and information, and to what extent they're starting to think more holistically about all these things.
Yeah, there's one thing that I'd just like to throw out there, something that we're currently grappling with, is describing the sensitivity of information. So we've got our CMP classification standards that classify things protected A, B, C, and then unclassified. But then we have requirements under MFIPA to designate personal information banks. And what we're kind of looking at here is how do we, across these different requirements and imperatives, how do we come up with something that's going to be pretty easy for our users to adapt and use, so that when they see something that's classified with a sensitivity of whatever it is that we go with, that they know what that means. And I think that that's some of the difficulty in our organizations as well, is there's all kinds of standards, there's all kinds of guidance out there, but some of it is contradictory, and you can't follow all of it. You've got to pick kind of a path, and you've got to create something that's usable. And that, I think, is where the rubber hits the road, and where things get pretty difficult, is finding that thing, that guidance document that is comprehensive enough that it covers all of your bases, and you make sure that you're a proper steward of the information, but is also not so complicated that people will just abandon it and not use it, or find ways around using it.
I'm just looking at the next question here and considering how to answer it. How should organizations go about preserving legacy geospatial data as they update it?
Great question.
It's an interesting question.
I don't know.
And, yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not a geospatial data expert, though I can say that Open North is starting to do some work in this area. So so stay tuned for some outputs that we create around that. In terms of preserving data, it's a good question about the extent to which preserving data in the format or the way it was collected, for a specific purpose in the past. I think there's a lot of there is a movement now towards greater collaboration around geospatial data between different jurisdictions, especially collaborating around different issues. I know, for instance, that and I know Esri is one of the will be also presenting at one of the events at this conference later. But I know that, for instance, Next Generation 911 is one driver of collaboration around geospatial data. That is so driving different jurisdictions that might, say, share emergency response services towards a shared data model, modeling addresses and road networks in a consistent way that they can be deployed in these new these next gen 911 systems. So I'm not so sure about the preserving legacy information, and maybe the person can clarify.
I can speak a little bit to that too, Steve. There's certainly some organizations out there some private companies that are focused on long-term digital preservation. So I'm thinking of companies like Preservica, Artifactual, that are being used currently by public archives and private archives as well. There certainly is a growing body of knowledge there. So I would suggest starting to tap into those kinds of resources. The National Archives of Canada is focused on doing some in-depth long-term digital preservation, and I haven't really looked into what they've been doing lately, but I would check out their site and see what's going on there, because that's really their job, is to help provide us with some guidance in terms of national strategy on long-term digital preservation.
Yeah, I think there's also an element here of like going back to the idea of knowing why you're doing what you're doing with data. You know, knowing the reasons why you're saving data, right? Why you want to preserve it, and what the sort of application is there is going to be critical in you know, determining what kind of, you know, mechanisms, what kind of framework, or what kind of like infrastructure, you know, spatial data infrastructure, for instance, that you're going to need to preserve that data over time. But also ensuring that it's available. You know, you know, just thinking about different geospatial data sets and just the complexity and kind of in making them you know, compatible with one another, and joining them up to you know, to their neighbors, and being able to still have that you know, being able to still realize the benefits of collaborating and coming and standardizing around data, creating greater interoperability, while still having that being able to have that historical lens on your, you know, whatever it's development data or things like that. So
yeah, just a little anecdote. When I started my career in archives, I worked for the city of Thunder Bay as a records analyst and archivist. And beyond building plans, our most used set of records were aerial photographs. Yeah, so it's interesting. Anyway, Cody is telling us that we only have 7 minutes left, so we want to make sure we get to all of the questions. Yeah, sure. Especially this one here from Connie McCutcheon. Hi, Connie. It's really nice to talk with you this way. Too bad we can't see your face. So any tips on the culture change aspect? Forgive me if I missed, joined a bit late. You didn't miss, we didn't talk about culture change. It's huge, isn't it? I know that in the different organizations that I've worked, you know, it's fairly easy to create a new policy, but to get people to actually adhere to it and use it, I think is the biggest difficulty. And I know, Connie, that you've attended ProSci Change Management, as have I, and there's some great tips there. But I think that the bottom line is you have to spend time understanding what people want and need, and don't create a process that is so difficult or convoluted that even though the end goal is noble, they will get so frustrated that they will give up. And I think that from my experience in records management, the most poignant case of that is just the horrible and Wild West state of shared drives all over organizations. Like this is one thing that is just one of the most difficult things to clean up. And even though people realize that it probably is good for you, they really don't want to take that medicine. So I think that what you have to do in these roles is you have to do that ugly behind the scenes work to make life easier for your users. Easier said than done.
I think that's a really important point about, like, you know, yeah, I mean, I think like thinking back to that issue of, you know, context is everything, and you need to recognize where you're at and where you're, you know, what the existing culture of data and information is within your organization, and work with that, right? You can't if you're pushing for radical changes, it's not going to, you're probably not going to get buy-in if people can't see the connection between their day-to-day work, for one thing, like and if they don't buy into the end goal, right? So I think meeting people where they're at is a key, and then being able to bring people along with you, or identify what kind of baby steps you can take to get to to get you in the direction, or at least start to move in the direction that you need to go. But yeah, it's definitely a big challenge. Who differentiates between fake records from authentic records for the public record?
Are you looking at me?
Looking at you there.
Okay, so that's a great question, but I don't think the question is actually who differentiates between fake records and authentic records. It's how. And the answer that I would give is the how is you can find out if a record is authentic by analyzing the process by which it came to be. So was the record generated through a procedure that is verifiable? So let me use the example of council minutes. Were the minutes created in the regular course of business through the city clerk's office and authenticated and signed off by the clerk and the chair of council? Those are some of the ways that you might differentiate between a fake or a real record. I think coming back to how was that record created? How did it come to be? Where was it published? Is it published through a regular and valid source? Those are the things that you would be looking at. This is a really big topic, and we could create a whole new conversation about it, but that's where I would start. And so Jonathan, I hope that kind of short answer gives you a little bit of help. But I don't know that it's, anybody has that role of chief authentication officer, but it is all of our responsibilities as government employees to ensure that what we're doing is both trustworthy and authentic.
I really like what you're saying, that it's really about that by virtue of the process being transparent or being legible, really, like to have a sense of what what's actually happening, that sort of confers trust on the record or the data or information, right? That's probably maybe about the best we can do. But definitely a big issue. And I see we're coming to time here. So with that, I think we can probably close out and say, and thank you again for attending and for listening to us, and thanks for your thoughtful questions. And I don't know, Anne, if you have any closing thoughts.
No, just Steve, it was great to meet you and to collaborate on this presentation. Thank you very much to Yuri and the team for the opportunity. It's a strange and awkward thing to be doing this. Feel like I'm speaking to myself, but yeah, thanks for the opportunity to connect.
Yeah, I echo that. Thanks for joining us in an era when probably everyone is all zoomed out these days. I know I am, but with that said, have a good rest of your day and enjoy the rest of the conference. And thanks again.